In order to defeat the Axis power of Japan, the United States has to come up with a strategy of getting closer and closer to mainland Japan. But standing between Hawaii and the mainland are a series of small islands that are fiercely defended by the Japanese. And so in order to come up with a plan for victory, between the Navy and the Army, they decide that island hopping is the way to go. That invading smaller islands, one by one, on the way to Japan would lead the Americans closer and closer to be able to start bombing Japan and possibly invade the mainland. Also, the part of this plan was to recapture the Philippines, the U.S. colony, in order to free the prisoners of war there. But the problem with this campaign is it's going to require an amphibious invasion of every single island. And so if you take a look at this map, there are a long series of battles that are going to take place as the United States jumps from island to island closer to the Philippines and then basically towards Japan. And so island hopping is going to be difficult, and the war in the Pacific is going to be much more fierce than the war in Europe. These small islands are going to be defended down to almost the last person by the Japanese. Part of this is the Bushido Code, which said that it's more honorable to die than to surrender. These islands had also been turned into fortresses. The Japanese had years and years to dig tunnels, trenches, hidden firing positions, and so essentially the Americans are attacking an island fortress every single time. The Navy also had to start worrying about kamikazes, suicide planes loaded with explosives that essentially the pilots sacrificed their lives to destroy a U.S. ship. And so all this difficult terrain led to heavy casualties among the Americans. So with every step closer to Japan, Americans are paying a very heavy price with lives. But the war in the sea, the naval war, is essentially won by October 1944 by the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It is it's the largest naval battle in all of human history, and the United States won a huge victory after Japan retreated. After Leyte Gulf, the U.S. Navy was in control of the Pacific Ocean, which allowed the United States Army. Which brings us to Iwo Jima in February-March of 1945. And Iwo Jima goes down in American history as one of the fiercest battles of the war. It's definitely the fiercest fighting of the campaign, and of the Japanese defenders, almost all of them either fight until they are dead or they commit ritual suicide at the end. Americans pay a heavy price for this, despite having full naval, artillery, and other support. But the goal is to capture these airfields on Iwo Jima because they're close enough to Japan to begin a massive bombing campaign of the mainland. And the most iconic photo of the war, the flag raising of Iwo Jima, goes down in American history as a memory of this campaign and of America's will to see through the war. In order to facilitate the island hopping campaign, the United States Navy needed to gain control of the Pacific. In October of 1944, the largest naval battle in history, and the decisive naval battle of the Pacific, takes place at Leyte Gulf near the Philippines. The United States wins a victory, and the Japanese Navy is going to retreat, leaving the United States in control of the Pacific Ocean. This allows the U.S. Army to launch a massive invasion to retake the Philippines. And so this massive naval battle at Leyte Gulf is going to put the United States in control of the southern Asian part of the Pacific Ocean. It's also going to mean that the United States can push closer and closer to mainland Japan. And so upon the invasion of the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur, who promised that he would return, waded ashore on the shores of the Philippines and declared to everyone, "I have returned." And so the United States began the campaign to retake their former colony of the Philippines. But the fighting on the Philippines is going to be fierce, and it's actually going to continue all the way till the Japanese surrender in 1945. And as the island hopping campaign continued into the early part of 1945, the fiercest battle of the campaign at Iwo Jima is going to take place. Iwo Jima is a small island. It's heavily fortified, but the United States needs this island in order to use their airfield to drop bombs on Japan to try to force an end to the war. The Japanese fight for every inch of Iwo Jima. And as you can see from the statistics, almost every single Japanese soldier fights to the death or commits ritual suicide in order to avoid capture by the Americans. The United States sacrifices nearly 7,000 lives in order to seize these airfields at Iwo Jima. And so Iwo Jima lives on in American memory as kind of an example of American valor and bravery, and the flag raising of Iwo Jima at Mount Suribachi becomes one of the most iconic photos in all of United States history. And so in order to bring an end to the war without having to invade mainland Japan, the United States stepped up its bombing campaign, using a new technology called napalm, which is a jelly that causes fires, and as it hits the ground, it spreads, were used on major cities like Tokyo. And the goal of this bombing, although it has heavy casualties and destroys civilian areas, is to try to bring an end to the war. After the United States sacrificed 12,000 lives to capture the large island of Okinawa in 1945, the United States began gearing up for its full invasion of Japan, using Okinawa as a staging point. And so by spring of 1945, the war is winding down. The United States is within striking distance of the Japanese mainland, but they are reluctant to actually send soldiers to invade the islands. Their logic was, if they fought at Iwo Jima and Okinawa and other small islands, how fiercely might the Japanese fight to defend the homeland? They were also concerned over kamikazes and the willingness of the Japanese soldiers to sacrifice their lives for victory. And so the thought was that the casualties could be massive, that it could cost over 1 million American lives in order to invade the Japanese mainland. And so generals and the president were looking for another way to get out of the situation. But kind of a good question is, why didn't Japan just surrender in spring of 1945? They're defeated, and they're actually willing to surrender, but on one condition. The Japanese are willing to surrender as the last Axis power if their emperor was allowed to stay in power. But for the United States, they thought that they demanded unconditional surrender. And President Harry Truman, as well as the other Allied leaders, did not feel that they could leave the emperor, who had led the country into war, to remain in power after its end. But unbeknownst to the Japanese, for years during the war, American as well as European scientists have been working on a new weapon harnessing a new technology that could bring a swift end to the war. This project was called the Manhattan Project, and it would usher in a new era in world history. And the Manhattan Project all starts with a letter written by Leo Szilard and co-signed by Albert Einstein. It was a letter written to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt about the possibility of the creation of nuclear bombs. Essentially, new science had been done that said that the splitting of the atom was not only possible, but also could carry with it an immense amount of energy. And Szilard's fear, as well as Einstein's, was that Germany had already begun developing an atomic bomb, which they had. And so both Germany and Britain were in the process of researching the atomic bomb, technology splitting the atom for war. And so the United States began researching by the creation of the Manhattan Project. And in 1942, at the University of Chicago, in association with the Manhattan Project, Enrico Fermi Lab, out in the suburbs, is named after this guy, and Leo Szilard built the first nuclear reactor at the University of Chicago. You can still go there today and see that first nuclear reactor. And so the Manhattan Project, after the initial reaction, began to pick up steam. It was super secretive, and very few people, in fact, not even the Vice President, Harry Truman, knew about the atomic bomb until he became president. And they put their lab in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in the middle of nowhere, where nobody would be able to stumble upon them or learn any of these secrets. And the leaders of this project are J. Robert Oppenheimer, considered one of the top physicists in all the world, who headed up a team of engineers and scientists. Many of the top physicists who work on the bomb actually fled from Axis powers to the United States. And on the military side, General Leslie Groves oversaw security of the Manhattan Project. Here's the facility at Los Alamos. It's essentially a giant campus of scientific reactors, labs, and housing for these scientists to live and work. And so they bring together some of the top minds in all the world and in America to engineer a weapon that would harness this new science. People who worked on the project included people like Niels Bohr, who came up with the model of the atom, J. Robert Oppenheimer, Richard Feynman, and Enrico Fermi, all of who are considered some of the greatest scientists to live in the 20th century. And so the first weapon they build is called the Trinity bomb, and that's what it looks like. That is the first nuclear bomb ever created in mankind's history. And so upon building Trinity, it was decided to conduct a nuclear test on July 16th of 1945. And on this day, the world entered the atomic age, and nothing would ever be the same now that the first nuclear weapons had been created. J. Robert Oppenheimer, upon viewing the scene, quoted the Bhagavad Gita, and he said, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." And the blast radius itself is massive, and it turns the sand to glass in a large radius. And upon the success of the initial test, two bombs are then built. The first is called Little Boy, and the second is called Fat Man. And these will be the only two nuclear bombs to ever be used on human targets. So at the end of the war, in July of 1945, the leaders of the Allied powers meet at Potsdam to talk about the end of the war. But as you can notice from the photo, Winston Churchill had been replaced by Prime Minister Attlee. FDR had died and was replaced by Harry Truman, and so only Stalin is going to be at the start of the war and at the end. And so the three leaders meet, and during this meeting, Truman hinted to Stalin of the Manhattan Project. But Stalin didn't actually react to kind of Truman's news because he had already known. The Soviet Union already had spies in the United States, another sign that the two countries would not be allies once the war was over. But at this Potsdam conference, they issue the Potsdam Declaration to Japan. It is an ultimatum that warns them to surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. There is no mention of the atomic bomb, but they are clear that they will not allow the Japanese to keep their emperor after the war. And so now it is on the desk of Harry Truman to decide whether or not the United States is going to use this new weapon, the atomic bomb, to bring an end to the war. In Truman's mind, it was never much of a decision to make. It was a war, Truman was a World War I veteran, and this weapon would bring an end to the war. And so Little Boy was loaded onto a bomber known as the Enola Gay, captained by Paul Tibbets, and they would carry the first atomic bomb to its target at Hiroshima. And so, on August 6th of 1945, the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, meaning this is the first time that a nuclear weapon had ever been used in human history. The devastation was total, destroying almost 63% of the entire city and wiping out a large amount of its population. No one had ever seen any weapon as destructive as this. And so it really is going to change everything about warfare. People were sometimes vaporized. Ashes basically seared onto surfaces because of the intense heat. Burns, radiation sickness, and all of these horrors would begin to emerge after the bomb. And so about 80,000 to 120,000 people were killed instantly by the blast. And in decades to come, many more would die from burns, from radiation sickness, meaning that the total death toll was much higher. And so for the United States, they were hoping that this bomb would force Japan's prompt surrender. But after Japan didn't surrender, after 3 days, the United States dropped the second atomic bomb at Nagasaki on August 9th of 1945. And this bomb had a similar effect to Hiroshima, flattening the city, causing massive casualties, and finally pushing for the end to the war. And in an interesting coincidence, the second atomic bomb was dropped on the day that the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, leaving it open to speculation about just what the purpose of using the second atomic bomb was. And so approximately 74,000 are killed in Nagasaki, and this will be the last nuclear bomb ever used against human targets in history so far. And so on August 15th, just a few days after the Nagasaki bombing, the emperor ordered that Japan surrender unconditionally to the Americans. And the surrender is signed on the deck of a United States ship, and on VJ Day, the war has finally come to an end. The event, the cataclysm that had dominated every aspect of life, that had cost so many lives and so much tragedy, had finally come to an end in August of 1945. and jubilant crowds turned out in Times Square, in Chicago, in all the American cities to cheer the end of the war and the return Americans hoped to a normal life. And in the aftermath of the war, the United Nations is going to be formed, which still exists today as an organization to mediate world conflicts. Its goal is to prevent another world war. War crimes trials were held, with some Japanese leaders being put on trial for things like the Bataan Death March and the rape of Nanking, and the Nuremberg trials. We put the Nazi leaders in a courtroom to stand judgment for the Holocaust. And these war crimes trials eventually became the basis for the precedent of international law and conduct between nations. And so at Nuremberg, a trial was held in which the full horror of the Holocaust was revealed, and many Nazis were sentenced to death for crimes against humanity. The United Nations began meeting in hopes that these working together, nations could avoid the circumstances that had led to the Second World War. And World War II is a watershed moment. After 1945, nothing is going to be the same. It's the most destructive war in human history. Out of this war, the Europeans' dominance of the world is going to end. And the United States and Soviet Union emerged as the superpowers that would lead the world forward. It began the start of the Cold War, where tensions between the United States and Soviet Union about the world after the war are going to flare up in a conflict that is going to dominate world history until the 1990s. World War II also ushers in the nuclear age, and nothing would ever be the same now that mankind possesses such a powerful weapon. But at home, this is going to lead to a rash of civil rights movements, where returning soldiers are going to be unwilling to accept unequal treatment, and women who had played such a vital role on the home front, as well as in the armed forces, are going to begin demanding a truly equal place in American society. And finally, this is going to lead to the United States taking a new position. For most of its history, Americans have been isolationist. But from World War II forward, the United States is going to forever, up until at least this point, be an internationalist country deeply involved in the affairs of the world.